Shame doesn't come from enemies. It comes from people who knew you before the image was polished, before the fairy tale, before the palace, before the press learned her name. And that's where this story really begins, not with a prince, not with a ring, but with a quiet rejection that never made headlines, until now.
Something strange here that's starting to become a pattern, and you can see it here in this video. Right after he says, "I found the love of my life," there is a weird pause of discomfort. You do not have to be a profiler or anything to see this. You'll feel it.
I'd now found the love of my life, and I now had the opportunity to start a family with her.
According to reports, Noelle was born in or around 1999.
The walls are closing in on Rachel Meghan Markle because I've been doing more and more digging, and the findings are shocking. And even her cousin, I mean, if you are fainted of heart, get yourself some sort of coffee or tea or chamomile tea to calm you down, because this is gonna be rough.
What I discovered was, of course, that she was hunting for a man in England from 2013, and she wanted wealth and she wanted fame, and she targeted. There's no doubt she targeted Harry.
Shame doesn't come from enemies. It comes from people who knew you before the image was polished, before the fairy tale, before the palace, before the press learned her name. Because here's the part nobody tells you. Prince Harry wasn't the first man warned about Meghan Markle. He was just the one who ignored it years before tiaras and titles. A quiet rejection happened. No headlines, no scandal, just a family that chose not to proceed. And once you hear why they walked away, everything that came after starts to look familiar. Because this isn't a breakup story, it's a pattern story. And once a pattern is named, you can't unsee it. So why didn't Harry see what ordinary people noticed first? That line should stop you cold, because it reframes everything. This was never about jealousy, never about class, never about royalty. This was about pattern recognition. Long before palace gates, long before Netflix cameras, long before royal grievances were monetized, there was a kitchen table judgment made by people with nothing to gain. And they said no. Quietly, carefully, without drama. Because families don't scream when they're concerned, they step back. And that's exactly what happened next.
Want him to be a prince or a princess, not knowing what the gender would be, which would be different from protocol, and that he wasn't going to receive security.
What?
It was really hard.
Every royal story pretends it starts at the gates, carriages, smiles, engagement interviews. But the real chapters begin earlier at kitchen tables with families who notice things institutions later document. Before princes, Meghan lived in a smaller world. Ambition without polish, drive without PR. And in that world was a man named Giuliano. More importantly, his family. Families don't overreact. They observe how someone handles disagreement, how loyalty works, whether relationships feel mutual or transactional. And according to accounts now resurfacing, they hesitated, not dramatically, quietly. Invitation slowed, commitment delayed, the future withheld. Wait, what? Because that kind of rejection doesn't come from jealousy. It comes from concern. Read between the lines. Invitation slowed, commitment delayed, the future withheld. That's not rage, that's evaluation. Families watch how someone handles friction, whether closeness feels mutual or strategic, whether affection deepens or disappears when challenged. And that's where the discomfort crept in. Because what they noticed wasn't explosive, it was subtle. A push-pull rhythm, intensity followed by withdrawal. And families have a name for that: instability.
Meghan began dating Giuliano, and the couple got married after having a child when Meghan was almost 20.
The kind of history that invites sympathy, not scrutiny. And Harry was built to accept it. He didn't just fall in love with Meghan, he recognized himself in her story. A woman mistreated by systems, misunderstood by institutions. It mirrored his own pain too perfectly to ignore. For Harry, emotional truth mattered more than procedural caution, and that's exactly when the palace began to feel uneasy. Because behind the scenes, royal vetting isn't about scandal, it's about patterns. This is where everything tilts. Because Harry didn't just hear her story, he felt seen inside it. Two misunderstood souls, two people wronged by systems, two narratives that lined up too perfectly. And when emotional truth replaces procedural caution, institutions get nervous. Not because they fear scandal, but because they recognize trajectory. Royal vetting doesn't look for crimes. It looks for gaps, clean breaks, no overlap. Histories that end neatly, but quietly. absences that don't make noise until they line up.
Meghan is a trained actress. What she does is that she studies people. She's not a good actress, but she is a trained one, right? She's been doing it her entire life. And there is no doubt that she studied Princess Diana. She studied her mannerisms towards Harry when he was a boy and the way that she grabs her face. And this is the psychopathic elements of what she does.
And once they did, the story stopped feeling random. And when this story resurfaced, social media lit up. TikTok stitching timelines together, tweets saying, wait, this happened before Harry memes reading, red flags don't appear overnight. One clip kept circulating, families don't reject futures for fun. Another post went viral. I'm not saying she planned this, but the math ain't math. Would you believe her if you saw that clip? Comment below. Fast, messy, relentless. Hollywood loves a scandal, just not this one. Once the timeline resurfaced, there was no putting it back. The internet didn't invent this, it connected it. Same rhythm, same arc, same ending. And the most uncomfortable question started circulating. If this happened before royalty, why did everyone pretend it started after? Because reinvention only works when nobody checks the earlier draft.
I'll tell you why. What she told the royal family, what she told Harry, wouldn't have jived, wouldn't have been consistent with the truth.
Inside the palace, tone shifted. Not anger, calculation. Early hesitations were reclassified as indicators. Giuliano's family, the abrupt end with Trevor Angelson, friendships that vanished without overlap, not accusations, a trajectory. Harry didn't hear caution, he heard betrayal, and so he doubled down publicly, emotionally. Love became defiance. The fairy tale turned ideological, and once opposition becomes moral failure, there's no room left for warning. This is where love became defiance. Every concern sounded like betrayal. Every hesitation sounded like sabotage. And when love turns ideological, warning becomes impossible. Because now it's not advice, it's oppression. And that's where the damage locks in. Here's the truth in 3 lines. The first rejection came before royalty. The warnings were quiet but consistent, and patterns don't disappear when titles appear. So tell me, do you think Harry ignored the signs, or was he never ready to see them? History doesn't shout, it waits. History doesn't shout, it waits. By the time realization arrived, it didn't come with rage. It didn't come with public confrontation. It didn't come with screaming headlines or explosive admissions. It came quietly, like shame always does. Because shame isn't loud, it doesn't perform, it doesn't post statements. Shame settles in when you realize the warnings weren't attacks, they were foreshadowing, and that's the part nobody likes to talk about. Harry didn't wake up one day and think, I was fooled. He woke up realizing something worse, that the people he accused of cruelty were repeating concerns that had already existed long before they ever knew his name. And once that truth sinks in, it doesn't provoke anger, it provokes isolation. That's why everything shifted after the wedding. Not suddenly, gradually. Defensiveness hardened into certainty. Certainty turned into distance. Distance became exile, emotional first, geographical second. Because when you can't admit you missed the signs, the only option left is to burn the map. That's when loyalty became a test. Anyone who questioned the narrative wasn't cautious, they were hostile. Anyone who hesitated wasn't thoughtful, they were dangerous. Anyone who remembered the past was accused of weaponizing it. And that's how the circle shrank. Not because people disappeared, but because overlap was no longer allowed. Old friendships faded without explanation. Former connections vanished without continuity. Entire chapters were erased, not argued with. And institutions noticed, not because they were offended, but because patterns repeat when unexamined. What families saw at kitchen tables, the palace saw in files. What Giuliano's family felt emotionally, royal aides mapped procedurally. Not accusations, not scandals, just trajectories. Intensity, alignment, advancement, exit, reinvention, every time. And Harry believed love could interrupt that cycle. That belief wasn't foolish, it was human. But history doesn't bend for sincerity, it observes outcomes. And the outcome was this. The warnings Harry thought were invented by tabloids predated the tabloids entirely. They came from people who had nothing to sell, nothing to gain. No platforms, no contracts, just concern. And that's the detail that keeps resurfacing, no matter how carefully the story is edited. Because enemies exaggerate, institutions document, but families? Families hesitate quietly when something doesn't feel stable. And once that realization hit, it didn't spark confrontation, it triggered doubling down. Because admitting you ignored the signs means admitting the collapse wasn't sabotage. It means admitting it was predictable. And that's a harder truth than betrayal. That's why the narrative became moral. Why opposition was reframed as cruelty. Why caution was rewritten as abuse. Why questions were declared violence. Because once disagreement becomes oppression, you never have to answer it. You only have to escape it. That escape looked like freedom on the outside. But on the inside, it looked like pressure. Because when you cut off every voice that warned you, you also cut off the voices that might catch you when it falls apart. And this is where the shame deepens. Not because of what outsiders say, but because of what you remember. The offhand comment you dismissed. The pause you ignored. The hesitation you reframed as jealousy. The moment you were warned and chose romance over recognition. And shame doesn't demand confession, it demands silence. That's why there was no dramatic reckoning, no public realization, no sudden reversal, just a slow unraveling behind closed doors. Because admitting you missed the pattern means admitting the future was never sabotaged, it was signposted. And that's why this story refuses to die. Not because it's scandalous, but because it's familiar. People recognize the arc. They've lived it. They've seen intensity mistaken for destiny, alignment confused with compatibility, support mistaken for surrender. And the moment someone says, "This feels transactional," they're accused of lacking faith. That accusation is the last line of defense before reality arrives. And when it doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives as distance, as exhaustion, as the weight of defending something that no longer explains itself. That's why the most damaging part of this story isn't the rejection, it's the editing. What was left out, what was smoothed over, what was erased so the narrative could survive. Because if this much had to be removed to make the story work, what else was rewritten? That's the question that keeps resurfacing. Not from tabloids, not from institutions, but from ordinary people who've seen this before. And history agrees with them. Patterns don't disappear when titles appear. They don't dissolve under prestige. They don't vanish because the stage gets bigger. They repeat until they're acknowledged. Harry wasn't betrayed by enemies. He was warned by people he never met. And that's the quietest tragedy of all. Because shame doesn't come from being attacked. It comes from realizing the truth arrived early, and you chose not to see it.